as it was in 2022. That's the first Makor. I'm sorry about the Makor. It was prepared. It was prepared by a friend of mine, Rabbi Segev, who spent the last 2 months sitting in the Knesset on this issue. He spent a lot of time working on this. Simcha. Okay. So the law as it stands at the moment says the following: Netilat zera tevutza lefi bakasha kedahalan. Retrieving sperm can be done as requested. The following: 1, 2, 3. 1. Bakashat shel bat hazug shel haniftar. The spouse, the wife of the person died. 2. Bakashat shel horav. The question for the parents. And 3. Haniftar she'achav anchayot. If the person who died left a will or left some instruction, that's what we're going to do. So the question became relevant at the moment because what about if we don't? If the person didn't leave any instruction, and the girlfriend wants to retrieve the sperm. So how do we define the word girlfriend? Is it that someone had been going out for a month, a year, they lived together, they had intentions to get married? Why could we say that the spouse or the parents can decide regarding the sperm of somebody who's not here? I can decide what to do with my body. That's also not 100% correct. However, how can somebody else make that decision? So that's really what the question is. And the reason that it interests me and us at Machon Puah is because it has a huge halachic ramification. Because what will happen is that when we retrieve that sperm, what do we do with it? So if there was a husband and wife, that's one question. What if we have somebody who wasn't married? The parents decide, we want to continue our son's legacy. He was killed in the war. It's very tragic. He was killed in a terrorist attack. It's very tragic. And we want to continue his legacy. So we're going to take a young woman who volunteers to become pregnant with this sperm, and our legacy will continue on. So that's a whole question of itself, a philosophical question, a proper halachic question. The halachic question to say is that permitted? So the Gemara Masechet Chulin, that's where this is the Mekorot. We're going to get onto the Mekorot. We're not going to do all of them, and it's a long daf, but it's important you have it in front of you, and because it is a difficult question. The Gemara Masechet Chulin speaks about the possibility of determining the nature of why somebody died, and the Gemara says, we'll just look at it, that the problem is that it's once somebody has died, to remove their anything from them, or to remove an organ, is what's called nivul hamet. Nivul hamet we're very concerned about. Nivul hamet means that we are degrading that person who is dead. Says Rav Kook in Makor Shtayim, in Dat Kohen, what is the reason that we have an Isur Nivul hamet? Why would that be prohibited? And he gives two answers, and just look at it, it's bolded. Chada me'etzem din kvura. The first is we have an obligation to bury somebody. It seems to be clear, most of the poskim say that Nivul hamet is Isur Torah. And the reason is because we have an obligation to bury that person. Once the person died, we have to bury them. Of course, we understand that has a ramification not only for removing sperm, but also, of course, for removing any organ. Can a person posthumously give their organs, heart, liver, lungs, and v'chule? So that has a big ramification. So the answer is we have to bury them. Answer 2, says Rav Kook, the other reason, also bolded, there's also a different problem, that once a person dies, we have to bury them as quick as possible. Since you live in Yerushalayim, I don't live in Yerushalayim, but you live in Yerushalayim, you know that we often do burials at night. It's one of the few places in the world that we do burials at night. Why do we do burials at night? Because there's a din in Yerushalayim, Minhag Yerushalayim, and it already comes from the Mishnah. It's not like Minhag Yerushalayim means anything that I do in Yerushalayim becomes Minhag Yerushalayim, but real Minhag Yerushalayim is actually mentioned in the Mishnah. The Mishnah mentions one of the Kedushot of Yerushalayim is Bal Talin, is that we don't, even one night. What does Bal Talin generally outside of Yerushalayim mean? We bury the person as quick as possible. Now, if we start taking their organs, not only are we not burying that organ, but we're also preventing or delaying unnecessarily the burial. That's the problems that Rav Kook says. Not about removing sperm. Page 2. See, we're going to get through it quickly. So, the Ritva on Masechet Makot says there's another reason. The Ritva says, we'll read it inside. V'had amreid shelo neherag adam me'olam. פרשינה בגמרא משום דאמרי להו לעדים המעידים על הרוצח ראיתם טריפה הרג, שלם הרג. Somebody who The Mishnah says, very famous Mishnah, Masechet Sanhedrin, that Batei Din very rarely put someone to death. They was very rarely use capital punishment. In fact, they would never use capital punishment. The Rebbe says, why? And the answer is because we say that Soni murdered somebody else. Reuven murdered Shimon, but maybe Shimon was a treifa. Maybe Shimon was going to die. He had a terminal illness and he was about to die. He was about to die. He's a treifa. Treifa is not it's a different prohibition, and we don't have we don't use capital punishment on the din of a treifa. So says the Ritva, Shalem Haya. Maybe he was not a treifa. Maybe he didn't have a terminal illness. Maybe the person already had an incision, and the person, when they cut them, already would start in that same incision. So did you do a post-mortem? To put someone to death, we have to know they killed someone who was alive, who wasn't going to die anyway. So in order to ascertain that, the Beit Din had to order a post-mortem. Very interesting idea, right? To get it, to have a death penalty, we have to make sure that you're liable to death penalty. So they did a post-mortem. So Rashi says.
Is that an autopsy?
Like what?
Is that an autopsy?
An autopsy, I guess, right? Right? The autopsy. They would check the Sheila, right? Good question, because we have this whole people have hafganot about these things, right? So the Gemara says it makes sense. Otherwise, he wouldn't say that also. אם לא היה טריפה, וכן פירש רבינו מאיר הלוי, ולפי פירוש זה היו צריכים לבודקו לאחר מיתה. בי"ח טריפות, they had to check him. אבל אין נכון בעיני כל רבותינו. זה הלכה דדין כן בטלת כל פרשת רוצחים. That's not true. It can't mean that that's what they did. Otherwise, nobody would be a רוצח. Nobody would be considered a murderer, because nobody would do a post-mortem, an autopsy would check the body. ועוד כי אם היו צריכים לבודקו ואחר מיתה בי"ח טריפות כמנבל טובה. In order to make that, we'd have to cut open the body. We have to see it has no internal disease. We'd have to do an autopsy, and that would be nivul hamet. And we just said there's this sort of nivul hamet of degrading the dead body. V'hakatuv, says the Ritva, what's the problem with nivul hamet? V'hafta l'reacha kamocha. It's not a problem of burial. It's not a problem of delaying the burial. It's a problem of hafta l'reacha kamocha. I wouldn't want him to cut open my body. I want to be buried complete, so I wouldn't want the person to be buried complete. We understand that those two reasons, or the three reasons, have a very different connotation. So if we can imagine it's v'hafta l'reacha kamocha, what does hafta l'reacha kamocha mean? Hafta l'reacha kamocha means I would have to do to other people what I would assume I would want done to me in that situation. So maybe in that situation, let's imagine, go back to our original question. We have a chayal. We don't know what his intentions were. Can we assume that he would want to remove sperm and to have children? Can we assume that? That's a very good question. We can assume that maybe if the husband was married, because the intention generally when people get married is they want to have children. But if he wasn't married, maybe we don't know. So that's a question of after we have to sort of second guess what a person wanted. Yes, sir.
Can this go back and forth? The question is also been discussed the other way. Like, let's say it's a female chayal, she gets killed, and the husband wants her eggs.
Okay, that's a good question, but it's generally not done for a different reason. Because generally we don't have a bank of eggs to retrieve. Because women don't have a bank of eggs to retrieve, unlike sperm, which is basically, the testicle is basically a machsan, or it contains a storehouse of sperm. We don't have that in women don't have that. They develop it later.
They do have women who harvest eggs.
You harvest eggs, but you have to be prepared for that. We have to give you 2 weeks of hormonal treatment.
I understand.
It could be a case that a woman froze her eggs prior to being killed, and then using it. That would be an interesting question, but that's not what we're discussing. We're talking about removing it posthumously. After a person is dead, removing the sperm. You can't do that with women. So, Kach HaKadosh Baruch Hu bara. Says the Rav Yisraeli, Rav Shaul Yisraeli, Amud HaYemini, source 4, לעניות דעתי מוכרח, שכל הקפדה הוא לא מצד הזמן שעודנו חי. We're not talking about when the person's still alive, כי אם דווקא מצד הביזיון שלאחר המתה. The question is, are we permitted to degrade someone after they died? It's actually a very interesting thing that we think about. Because think in Judaism how much we spend, how much importance we give to dead bodies. And I think the reason is, and many of the philosophers have spoken about this, is because we give so much importance to life. The body has been a receptacle for the soul, and that we have to give care, we have to give credence for, we have to give honor for. If we honor the body, how much more do we honor the soul? If we've honored the body after the person died, how much more so when the person is alive? That should give us a little bit of a musar, how we should treat each other when we're very good about treating people when they're dead. Yes, sir.
Using the term degrade.
Yeah.
I thought there were 4 things you could do with a body after it's died. You could take urine, feces, blood, or sperm, and it would not degrade the body at all.
Talking halachically or medically?
No, I'm asking.
I never heard that distinction. Interesting. I never heard that distinction. Why not? But I never heard distinction. All right. So, says Rav Yisrael, "Mikan shegam benidon didan shemakpidim shelo levazoto mitzad nechshav re'echa." So we understand that he's re'echa. We don't degrade him because re'echa. We understand that re'echa doesn't mean my neighbor who's alive. Is my neighbor after they died. And we have a lot of kavod that we give to dead people after they died as re'echa. But we actually were on the way here, and there was on the radio there was a song by Dedi Gacha who died not so long ago. And my wife said, "Look, it's amazing that this person, his music lives on, and it gives so much pleasure even after they're dead." Like we understand that people have a longevity. So the question is, a nivul hamet is a sil Torah. It seems to be ma'after re'echa kamocha, or delaying burial, or that a person should be buried with those things. So you're going to say, yeah, but sperm isn't the same as taking a heart, because a heart is an essential organ, and a B is a large organ. And there's been a discussion about taking something that's very small. What's very small? Halacha, we have the smallest thing is a kazayit. A kazayit is the size of, not an olive that we have today, like the really big olives. Something you get really big olives, those big olives, that's a kazayit. So is there a question of nivul hamet in less than a kazayit? Which relates to the question that the person asked about secretions. Sperm's not really secretion, but yes, sir.
Well, what about like in terms of a transplant, saving a life?
Oh, you have an excellent question. We're going to come to your point in a moment. Hopefully we'll get there. Okay, so what about less than a kazayit? Because here we have less than a kazayit. I might perceive here. So the Tosafot Yom Tov says that we have to bury a kazayit min hamet. Aval kashe in the middle. Kashe davilei lahaloch achal shiur sheragil latzniya velo achal shiur tumato. The amount of tumah is a kazayit. So then maybe less than a kazayit is what? It doesn't metameh, so now it's not an item, it's not an entity. So we have another shiur, a shiur of Shabbat. Shabbat is that I want to carry something from one domain to another domain, even less than a kazayit. If there's a use for it, it's considered to be an entity. So the question that the Tosfot Yom Tov is asking is, how do we define, he's not asking a question, we're giving it a philosophical answer, how do we define an entity? I'm not allowed to remove an entity from a dead body because nivul hamet. So is sperm an entity? That's your question. Is it entity because it's a small amount? So how do we define that? Is that by tumantara, so less than a kazayit, or is that by Shabbat, so it could be even something much smaller? Ubemet, and go to the second last line. Ubemet nami yashar she'al pachot mikazayit eno mitzuveh lekofro. It's possible that we're not obliged to bury related to a dead person something that's smaller than a kazayit. If we said, as we just said before, Rav Kook said, that the problem of nivul hamet is not to degrade the body in of its such, but to prevent it being buried. So if somebody had a small amount of, let's imagine, they had an appendage of them that fell off, they wouldn't be obligated to bury it if it was less than a kazayit. We generally don't have that. It could be that a person had, sometimes we can have, after the person was burnt, so what's left is less than a kazayit. The question is, do we have even a chovah to bury that? And that's very relevant in today's, in our situation. The minchad chinuch, we'll skip to source 7. Yes, sir.
When we're dealing about the small item, even if we're talking about even if a b'lias, an ant, if someone eats an ant, he's still over on.
So that's an excellent question, which you said before. That's a question, a much larger halachic and philosophical question, is in what do we took at the question of entities, is that the same throughout halachic reality? And the answer clearly is not. Because small items, we have in this week's parasha, the smallest item that exists is kinah, is the the jukim. Lice. That's very small. Ad Kedei Kav that says that avodah zarah doesn't have any interaction with that. That's only yetz be'eluhim. So there are small items, and they would be prohibited. Anything smaller than that, we're allowed to eat.
If it's a Bria Shlema.
Only if it's a Bria Shlema, not Bria Shlema. But it wasn't a whole question about the water in New York. They had very small microscopic items in it. I'll tell you the truth. All water has small microscopic items in it. It's not true. Everything has.
If you
Call
can't
it.
see it with the naked eye, you can't see it at all.
Oh, so that's a question, right? Naked eyes. What if I have a magnifying glass? But we see that halachic entities are different. That would be a great book or a series of books or a PhD thesis about different halachic entities. How do we define shiurim different and why? It's a good question. There's a question in the back. Yes, sir.
A person goes to elective surgeon and remove a part of the body, part of the knee, the elbow, whatever it is. It's more than a kazayit. They remove it.
Lechora, you have to bury it. If it's a question whether it has a bone, doesn't have a bone. If someone amputates a limb, halachically that should be buried. Should be buried. Look up Pashut to say no. We'll see in a moment why that's not 100% not true. Yes.
You didn't raise the issue. What happens if the wishes of the person who died?
We're going to come to that. Nagila Zegam. Nagila Zegam. Yes, sir.
What about crow?
One more thing. Yeah?
Are you aware of all the cows that were involved in the attack? October 7th.
Yeah.
Now they have those cows who have blood inside there. So they put it aside. I saw them. They put it aside. And I don't know. You know?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question again. We'll look at the next source and I think I have an answer for you. Okay, so look at the Mincha Chinuch. The Mincha Chinuch says, "V'ni'eh daf v'kazayit minamet noheg mitzvat kvura." That even with a kazayit we bury, which is similar to what the gentleman just said about blood and other things we know. Blood is a different reason for it, because we think that blood, it's clear that the neshama left when the blood drained out. What blood was the dam neshama? We don't know. And therefore the halacha is we bury all blood. I had a friend who was killed in an accident and in the snow, and we dug up all the snow which had blood in it in order to bury it with it. Because I don't know which blood is so blood is a slightly different entity. Here says the chinuch, but we bury even less than the kazayit. Why? Af linyan tumat kohanim shemetamim lemet mitzvah. Why? Because we're worried about tumat kohanim. We're worried that. So let's imagine that we have a nefel. A nefel is an aborted fetus. It's not chayad b'kvura. The reason that we bury it or that we destroy it is because we're worried about tumat kohanim. That if we just throw it away, then it will be body parts. It'll be around, and that will cause tumah for the kohanim. That's the problem. So the question is, how much are we obligated to bury? In the Encyclopedia Refuit Talmudit Hilchatit of Professor Steinberg, Makor 8, he says the following: Yes, v'him shenivul. So that's about burying. A question about degrading. Nivul nechshav rak mashe nikra nivul legabei chai. There are those that hold that degrading. We know what degrading is. Degrading is to remove something that during life would be considered to be degrading. So if I would remove an organ from a person, that would be degrading. Therefore, if a woman died, we have a Gemara like that. I think we're going to get to in a moment. That if a woman dies during and she's pregnant, she dies during childbirth or right before childbirth, we perform a cesarean section in order to remove the baby. Why is it not considered nivul met? Very simple, because that's not considered nivul chai. Because people come to have cesarean section operations willingly, and therefore that's not considered to be nivul met. Interesting. How does that bear on our question about removing sperm? Whether that's talking about treatment or just investigation. Ubilvad, however, the next page, page 3, ubilvad shadgima lo yalel kazayit. However, if we remove, so we do a biopsy after the person died to see what they died from, we're not allowed to remove halachically more than a kazayit. That's considered to be the shi'ur of nivul hamet. V'lo yichlol chalakim mugdarim keivar min hamet, and not to include, as the person said, you have a bone, you don't have a bone, you bury it b'chulei. So it seems to be that less than a kazayit wouldn't be considered to be nivul hamet. So if we remove 2 milliliters of seminal fluid, in which you will have potentially millions of sperm cells, so that's not considered nivul amet. In Makor Teisha, the Vad Atziborit that actually tried to have some definition of removing sperm al pi halacha, says the following: Halacha ro'eh b'chashivut rabba biyoter l'shmira al kvod hamet. In source 9, V'al pigiyah b'shlemut gufa. The halacha sees very important preserving the dead body, preserving the physical dead body, and having any degrading that is karuch be'isurim shonim. There's different prohibitions, not only the prohibition of nivul hamet. Adam shemet eno hofech liyot gush basar chaser erech. Someone that dies, this is what the Rabbanut Arashit said. There's someone that dies isn't considered to be a lump of flesh. We have kavod to a dead body, buried. Elegam lachar moto yesh begufo kedusha. After a person died, their body still has kedusha. Nivul hamet ubizyonon nechshavim liisur min haTorah. To degrade a body is considered isur Torah. Od kruchim bepulot biyitur. There's also a question about the obligation of burial. The Rabbanut made a distinction between these. Halanat hamet, not burying the body. Michshol lekohanim, we just said, all the things we just said. Hafra bekiyum dinei aninut v'avilut v'chulei. We're preventing a person starting to sit shiva. That's a whole shir in itself. Is can you sit shiva before the person was buried? We learned it from Yaakov Avinu. Whether they sat shiva before he was buried, after he was buried. There's a whole shir in itself. Another time, in 3 years' time, we'll come and give that shir. יחד עם זאת, אין איסור הלכתי בלקיחת ביופסיה מחט מן המת. Even so, there is no prohibition of having a biopsy, removing a needle, לצורכי אבחון ובירור, to do a check, כאשר מדובר בדגימת שאינו עולה ל-20 גרם. If we're talking about removing something less than 20 grams, which is a kazayit. So that's what the Rabbanut says. ובוודאי כאשר מדובר בדגימה קטנות וכו' וכו'. So, you say, well, it's nivul hamet. Nivul hamet is not so clear for something less than a kazayit. So now, therefore, it doesn't seem to be nivul hamet, although there are those who disagree. There's also nivul hamet we said here is only permitted when you have a reason. What about there's a mitzvah? What about in the case of there's a need to degrade the body? Says the Noda B'Yehuda in Makor 10, עוד הביא כבוד מעלתו ראיה מסוגיה דחולין. וכן כתב משום עיבוד נשמה דהי ניבולי הרי להציל הרוצח היה מותר לנבל הגורג. Why were they able to do an autopsy, a biopsy, a post-mortem of the dead body? To save the murderer, the potential murderer. So what do you see? You're allowed to do nivul hamet if there's a need to save somebody's life. That would make sense. To say, I'm not really saving, like, we think today, as someone said about transplants. So to remove a heart to give to another person, that's a need. This is not the case here. We have a no-gooder, who's a potential murderer. Nobody in this room, I think, ever had a charge, apart from me, had a charge against them that they were murderers, right? So it has to be someone who wasn't so good, it's not no gooder to begin with. And in order to save them being killed, we do a post-mortem, we do an autopsy of the dead body. So it says in Noda B'Yehuda. So what do you see? So in the case of a need, we are allowed to do nivul hamet. Continues. There you can say he definitely saves his life. Here that you want to do some sort of investigation to find out why they died, that's not so clear that we definitely can save that person's life, somebody else's life. Maybe we can, maybe not. The reality is, and we have this a lot of times with fetuses that are aborted, we used to send them to do post-mortems, to do autopsies. Today, really the answer is you really get very, very seldom, rarely, do we get any information that has any impact on anybody's life. And it's a lot of unnecessary grievance for the parents who are just waiting to start moving on, whether they're sitting shiva or not sitting shiva. So the truth is, you don't really get a lot of benefit many times from an autopsy. Sham gam kein safek hu shema yimatza treifa. Maybe we don't know if he's going to find treifa. Ve'od begam safek pikuach nefesh doche kol isurim shebetorah. Here's safek pikuach nefesh. We can save the murderer's life. Ve'erich malato b'devar ze. V'nei b'ze aminan delechora divrei gemara תמוהים. דאין כאמר, איך כאמר משום עיבוד נשמה, דהי נבולי דאדרבה. The opposite, he says. If we degrade the body, we'll find that he wasn't a treifa, then we'll put the guy to death. So the whole nivul hamet wasn't to save his life. The nivul hamet was to put him to death. Why? Because until we did the autopsy, what do we think? Maybe the murderer killed a treifa, so we have a suffix to not put him to death. But once we did the autopsy, we find out, no, he was healthy. You're a murderer. Says the Nodabiyah, exact opposite of what you just said. To save a life, of course you're allowed to do an autopsy. So you want to save a life. You're allowed to remove a heart, and we'll talk about how that works. I think we've spoken about that here in the past, about organ transplants, the whole question of itself. Says, no, that's not the reason here. It's not to save someone's life. Verkehrt. It's to put someone to death. And you still see that we're allowed to do an autopsy. Says the Noda B'Yehuda, Anu rotzim la'amit ha'rotzech ve'im lo yinatzel ha'rotzech. So we go to the end. ועוד היי אמרינן שעולם לא ירג הרוצח בלי בדיקת הנהרג, אם כן ניבול זה הוא לכבודו של הנרצח. It's not for the good of the murderer, it's for the honor of the person who was killed. That we'll know that he in fact was murdered. That, says in OW, that is what the Gemara is talking about. We're allowed to do an autopsy, we're allowed to do a post-mortem on the dead body to find out that the person really was a murderer. How's that possible? It doesn't make any sense. It should be asur, because let's even going. No one will ever be a murderer. He says no. That's the kavod of the person who was murdered. That we'll know what happened to them. We'll have a vadat chakira. We'll know what happened to them. And therefore that's considered tzorech. And in the case of tzorech, we're allowed to do nivul hamet. Not only in the case of mitzvah, in the case of tzorech, in the case of a need. V'kol zma shehu lichvodo ein bo mishum nivul. Anything that was needed is not considered to be nivul. We'll skip over the next verse. So it seems to be that there's no nivul hamet. Why? Because it's less than a kazayit. Well, maybe it's more than a kazayit, but it's for tzorech. What's a tzorech? That's a good question. Is removing sperm from a dead soldier for his honor? Because he's not requesting it. If he left it instructive, that's one thing. But he didn't leave it instructive. The parents or the girlfriend says, "Oh, we think he wanted to have baby." How do we know? How do you know that? Maybe he didn't want to have it. I don't want to be. I wasn't asked to be born. Who says that that's lichvodo? It seems to be intuitive, but it's not so pashut. So can you mekayim the mitzvah approval when you're dead? I would say the answer is no. Rav Nebenzahl told me once, I argued with Rav Nebenzahl this case once, quite vehemently. He was of the opinion that yes, I think it's very hard to say that logically. We don't mekayim mitzvah when we're dead. He's not mekayim mitzvah. I wrote an article about Tchumen. What? What are you saying? So this question, am I mekayim mitzvah approval by my dead son having a baby in my name? It's a shelah. It's a good question. You have a shelah tova. All right. That's a completely different question. It's a shelah acheret. That you can say that's a shelah mula. In that case, did he make a mitzvah approval? Why? Because it's not so pashut that a mitzvah approval is having the baby. Maybe mitzvah approval is getting your wife pregnant. It seems to make sense, right? They generally come together. So it's not so pashut that approval actually means delivering a baby. So there he has, retroactively we'll find out. I mean, how do you become the mitzvah approval stam bichlal? It's by having grandchildren, not by having children. That's a mitzvah chinuch. When your children have children, then you become the mitzvah approval. So when do you become the mitzvah? You found out, 25 years later, after you had the children, that you were become the mitzvah. So, and you have to have a boy and a girl from your boys and girls. Is it okay, Osman? Yes, sir. You want to hear, and then I come to you in a moment.
I didn't want to monopolize this with the question, but it's kind of obvious. and that is that when I learned about the Torah and about rabbinic, whether something was Torah or rabbinic through the Rambam.
Yeah.
I remember asking my rabbi, what about current times? Like, who's deciding this now because new things are coming up?
Right.
And he said, really nobody. We had the original, what was said, and now current rabbis are trying current rabbis are trying to decipher it.
Correct.
So in this case, since this is obviously a modern application, if you went just with simply the 10 Commandments of honoring your mother and father, and the role that parents have, the incredible
Okay.
connection parents have, would they not have the rights, therefore, to state what would happen with their child?
So that's there's a lot to impact on that, which you don't have time to. That's a whole other show in itself. However, first of all, just much briefly, the determining when something is from the Torah or rabbinic has already been done.
Right.
So Shabbat is from the Torah. Is lighting the electric light on Shabbat from the Torah or rabbinic? That's a different question. But the basis of the Torah is clearly halachic. It clearly has been defined, Torah or rabbinic, and there's a fascinating, which I think we've mentioned, I'm sure we've mentioned here in the past, there's a fascinating Weitzman that says that once it becomes the modus operandi, the regular modus operandi, that's what the Torah meant. That's a very fascinating idea, not accepted by everybody, but it's a fascinating idea. The second thing is you said about rights. The Torah doesn't see rights, the Torah sees obligations. And the idea that I have the right to decide what goes with my child, as I heard from Rabbi Sachs, alav shalom, is a Roman idea. That Romans believe that people owned their children, and therefore you're able to adopt a child, because I can take a child from you and give it to you. That's not a Jewish idea. Lo kayam in Judaism, that I own my children. I have no ownership of my children. I have an obligation to my children. It's mitzvot haben ala av, av ala ben, says the Mishnah in Masechet Kiddushin. I have an obligation to my children. My children have an obligation to me. There's no ownership. They don't own me, I don't own them. You can't divorce your parents in halakha, because you never own them.
Honor
You were never married to them.
Honor and own should not be.
Owning is an
confused.
obligation, not an owning. Yes. One here in the back and then here.
What about as the mitzvah, the Shabbos Yitzhara below the Tov Bara?
Correct. That's the question. It's not a mitzvah. I mentioned that it's l'shevet, lo l'tov bara, l'shevet yitzhara. It's mentioned in Sefer Yeshayahu. It's not so pashut that it's a mitzvah. It's not even clear it's a mitzvah de Rabbanan. How it may be a mitzvah de Rabbanan. L'shevet means that the world should be inhabited. That's what Rav Nebenzahl said to me. Never said it doesn't matter whether you were compos mentis at the point of Mekayim the mitzvah. So even if you're now dead, you Mekayim the mitzvah l'shevet. So that's interesting. There's not so pashut. It's definitely not a mitzvah from the Torah. The l'shevet is mitzvah in Yeshayahu. There's another mitzvah which is the erev al tanach yedeh, mentioned in Kohelet, which is just to continue having children at any age. So guys, there's any age. Yes.
Practice makes perfect.
So the Chinuch says that. Mincha Chinuch says. I think it's pretty intuitive. The Gemara seems to say that, but the Mincha Chinuch speaks about it. Mitzvah Aleph speaks about it. Okay. So, what about having children? We said for Tzorech is the question. What about having children? The Gemara in Masechet Erechin in source 12. Ha'isha she'eshva lamashber. We said this is the makor that we saw already. Woman sits on the birthing chair. It's very interesting. I said to my students yesterday. The word mashber means broken.
Yeah.
The word mashbir means giving sustenance. Like Yosef was the mashbir. You have the mashbir letzarcham. That's where I go to. It's very interesting. Those two words, shever and sever, actually the same word. So when you break the amniotic, the membranes, and the child comes out, so the breaking causes sustenance. Interesting idea. So the Sevid ala Mashber, the woman sits on the birthing chair, and what happens to her? V'meta, lo aleinu, she dies during birth. B'Shabbat. Mevi'im sakin, we bring a knife, u'mekar'im et krisa, we do a cesarean, posthumous cesarean section, u'motzim et evlat, and we make out the dead child. Says Rav Binyamin Orbach in Chut Nachal Eshkol, Mekor 13, ועוד אף ניבול מת אסור מחמת ביזיון המת. Isn't that nivul hamet, more nivul hamet than that you can't get? We sliced open the abdominal wall to remove the baby. Mikol makom lichvodo mutar. It's for his honor. It's in order to bring forth life. Why? The nichala lachiyot zera. She would want the baby to live. Therefore, if I can imagine that the pregnant woman who's giving birth would want the baby to live. So what we just said, very interesting, is nivul hamet, we have to guess what the person wanted. We have to guess what was their intent. And that sounds very simple, but that's very complicated. Because there's an ongoing debate in the Knesset as we're speaking about the question of how can we make that the definition. Can we imagine that it's different someone who is married or not married? The parents can decide that. You said before, honoring parents, but the parents can decide. Can the parents decide that my son wanted, he spoke about having children, he wanted to have a child? That's different than a woman who's pregnant, who's about to give birth, sitting on the mashber, she's already about to give birth, is different. Says the Binyan Sion in Makor 14. והיינו משום דלא שייך מחילה לאחר מיתה, ואם כן לא נאמר דאדם מוכל זולתו ולפי זה, therefore, ביושבת על המשבר בסכנת מוות, a woman who's on the birthing chair, she's about to die, והקשותה בלידתה, במסתמה עולה על דעתה, שאם תמות יפתחו ביתה. She has that intent. She understands that when she comes to give birth, if she dies, they will remove the baby, not let the baby die. להציל הבלד, בפרט שזה ידוע בדיני רפואה, because that's the way the medicine works. That's an assumption. A serious assumption here is that a person that comes to give birth wants to have a baby. That's a serious and pretty much solid assumption. Says Rav Zalman Nehemiah Goldberg Zatzal. He was the Rav Shlomo Zalman's son-in-law. He died not so long ago, last year. He says, when the question was, again, carrying embryos for somebody who died, without the consent, the agreement of the person who died, I can't take someone else's embryos and use them. But they froze them in order to have baby. But I can't take them. They don't belong to me. I don't have ownership of them. But if there was already a contract, or the person put an intent, or afilu umdan barur, we have a clear assumption, so no, that's what they wanted, as ein bekach isur, then there's no prohibition. I can't take somebody else's genetic material and use it. But if I assume that's what they wanted, then I can. Wow. So assumptions are pretty tough, right? Because I don't know exactly what a person wants. If they wrote down, I'm going into war, if I die, my sperm should be taken and used for my wife, that's pretty solid. But most people don't leave such a tzava. Most people don't leave that. And even the woman here who's Makshal Alet, she didn't have a written agreement that I want when I died for you to do a cesarean, but that's a pretty solid assumption. But is it a solid assumption that an 18-year-old soldier really wanted to have his sperm to be used by some random woman and to have children? So it's not so pashut. But it's not so clear to say that. We don't know. And even the parents think that. I don't know if the parents have necessarily that jurisdiction to make an assumption what their children wanted. How many people here know what their children want? Their grandchildren want. Great-grandchildren want. I don't know what they want. You know what they want? They want a credit card, yeah, but that's not...
They don't
Yeah.
want to get killed.
What?
I think they don't want to get killed.
But that's different, not getting killed, than having children. That's a very different assumption. That's a very different assumption. We're talking about not, I want the country to protect me, the state to protect me. But when I die, I don't know if I want to take my sperm and use it for another child. I don't know. I don't know. We don't know that. Talking about even people who are married, they have already 5, 6 children. We have people like that were killed. I don't know. We don't know that we can make that decision. Says Rav Goldberg, we're continuing. לעניין זה נוגעת גם העובדה שהתורה החשיבה מאוד את רצון אנושי להשארת שם וזכר בעולם. We have to take into account that Torah assumed that people want to leave a legacy in the world. They want to leave their name. How do we learn that? That's Yibum. The whole din of Yibum comes to the idea that we assume that person wanted to have their name.
From somebody previous generation.
What?
Talking about getting the name of your grandfather, great-grandfather.
Right, getting names. We have the name continues. Want to continue? Yeah. כפי שניתן ללמוד מפרשת ייבום. Says his father-in-law, Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, source 16, גם זה פשוט וברור, לפנים על ידי הזרעה מלאכותית, ליקה הקמת שם. It's true that people want to have children, but having a child through in vitro fertilization or through insemination isn't considered leaving a legacy. Because it's not so simple, at least when Rav Shlomo Zalman wrote that it's really, there's a relationship between the child and the father was questioned. Let's ask a different question, a question I think we've asked here before. I must have asked this because this is what I do. So I'm glad that I was here for so many years and didn't give the shiur. Do you mekayim the mitzvah pruvu through having children through in vitro fertilization, through IUI. Let's ask a different question. Are you obligated to have that? If a person doesn't have children, are they obligated to have IVF or to have IUI in order to have children? I think most answers will be no. Most persons will say you're not obligated. And we wrote several articles about that in Tchumen, Chavgimel, etc. V'lo mitkayim klal mitzvat yibum. We can't say yibum if one child, if two brothers were married, there's two brothers and one's married and his wife dies. We don't have to do insemination, neither with the sperm of the dead husband nor with the sperm of the brother-in-law. Yibum is a different question. The Omakam nemisad yibum through insemination. It's only having relations. Even if she's not able to get pregnant, still mitzvah yibum. So we can say. So now we say that we are able to do nivulamet. We're able to degrade the body for getting pregnant. Oh, sorry, for having children. We saw that from the woman who's Yosef Dal Mashber. But the question is this similar? Because to take the sperm and to do an insemination, which is what we're going to do, there's going to be no intercourse, the guy's dead, l'tzarenu. So we're going to take the sperm and we're going to use it as an insemination for somebody else, which is not so pashut that we've kind of mitzvah pruvu. So is it really a mitzvah of having children? We can assume that's the way we want to have children. Shatova. So we have another siman shelah on this whole question of the permissibility. What about other operations posthumously? Rav Moshe Feinstein in source 17 says the following: Nir'eh la'aniyut dati, ve'im lo yidchatchu evarim ve'lo yiftechu tzevaro ubitno. He says about a postmortem, about a postmortem autopsy, that if we don't cut the organs and we don't cut the neck and the abdomen, rak rotzim lachtoch needle la'tzi mimenu eze lachluchit. They just want to put in a needle to remove something, to remove basically blood, to see the DNA. That's what we're doing. Loda mizeh eze devar nogim lemachala zot, to see about the danger, about the illness. Ein lachshiv nivul. That's not considered nivul. Why? Shaharei devar kazeh matzui tua bezmanenu sosim gam ken lechaim. Because we feel that living people are very happy to go and have a blood test. Very happy to go and remove needles. People, they said to you, would you like to remove a kidney? I don't know. But would you like to do a blood test? People are happy to do a blood test. So it says in Moshe, if you do it during life, it can't be nivul amet. Because we just said that nivul amet is only what people wouldn't do when they were alive. And therefore, removing the organs, that's a different thing. But taking a blood test, that's not a problem. Gam ken lechaim. V'yesh la'tir b'pshitut. V'chein lotzi ma'at dam. To remove a little bit of blood. I think it's similar to what the person said about removing. That's maybe where you got it from. Ukadome alidei needle. Eino nivul v'yesh latir. That's mutar. Va'af be'lo matzati zeh bepirush. I didn't find it anywhere. Says Moshe Feinstein. It makes sense. 1 second. Nir'eh zeh la'niu dati baru. It seems that it's clear. It's intuitive. I don't need a source. ולכן מה ששמעתי שאפשר לראות על ידי needle באלקטרי שיחתכו בגופו של מת כל חולי שבו. We can see through the needle, through the genetic testing, we can see pretty much everything. מה שצריך לרופאים לדעת, whatever the doctor needs to do, אם אמת הדבר, if that's true, נראה שאין לאסור זה משום שאין בזה שום ניבול. That's not called ניבול. That's not called degrading. ואני חותמו כאבך, מוישה פיינשטיין. Yes?
Couldn't you say the same thing about a kidney? Because not living people give kidneys to others.
How many people in this room have donated? We're not going to show of hands, but I'm going to guess.
I know.
How many people in this room have donated a kidney? I'm going to guess less than 10%.
Okay, but from a halachic point of view,
It's a good question.
it's considered acceptable to give a kidney.
Correct.
Who needs one. So therefore,
I don't. That's
it's
an
not
excellent
any
question.
bull.
Shela mu'ula. Is what Rav Moshe says is what's halachically accepted,
Yeah.
or is what he's saying is what's generally done? It's an
Okay,
excellent question.
those are two different-
Shela mu'ula.
But there are now more and more people.
I agree with you, but the fact that there are more and more people, I'd say you take the average populace, less than 10% of people. It's much less than 10%. I'm being nice. It's less than 1% of people.
But you still haven't addressed the question. What happens if the person when he's alive, he agrees?
I wanted to do it. Excellent. That's a good question. Okay. Says the Encyclopedia Rafui, we hopefully come to that. לכאורה נראה שכללי היתר מוגבלים דווקא בפעולות נוסעות באנשים חיים לצורך בירור וכו'. Says the Encyclopedia, says Professor Steinberg, that's talking about things that people do for a purpose of doing some test. You know, you're going to do a blood test every day. People don't do it. But people do it for, you need to, every so often, you need to do a blood test. Okay, I'll do it. אבל בפעילות הנעשות בין אנשים חיים לצורך רפואי והצלה, אסורות בגוף המת. But if it's somebody that's come to treat you, that we can't do for the dead person, which may be similar to your question about the kidney. What's it make a difference? What's to come to do a diagnosis you're allowed to do after the person died? What's the treatment you're not allowed to do? Why? All the examples we have in the Gemara and the Chazal, they're all about diagnosis. Like we saw with the dead person, the murdered person. It's a diagnosis, it's not a treatment. Only if it's a lifesaver. There's a question about whether your question before is a lifesaver. And so, maybe we'll say, so even that, of removing a needle, putting a needle and doing a testicular biopsy and removing sperm, which Moshe says is fine, says Professor Steinberg, no, because we only allowed it for diagnosis, not for treatment. And to have a baby would be treatment. Yes?
The question is experimentation.
Correct.
If you could treat a dead body to rescue other people, what happens?
I missed your point.
You want to find out the disease.
Right.
If you cut this person open, you may rescue 25. You're looking for.
So that's a good question. But it's, again, that's a diagnosis. It's not necessarily. I'm not removing an organ like we said with a kidney. That lahore seems to be a problem. But that's what it seems to be a problem. That the idea of removing an organ that's going to save some life now is different than doing a diagnosis. A diagnosis may save hundreds of people, potentially. Yeah. Yes?
Would you feel any different? Like in America, the vast majority of organ donation, especially among youth, is from the driver license. When they get a driver license, which virtually everyone gets, you have to decide then. You don't have to do it only, right?
You have to opt out.
So if here, when someone went into the Army, if they answered a questionnaire and said, I agree, would you feel any different?
We're going to get to that in a second. That's your question. Okay. So my friend Rabbi Lior Segev, who wrote this, who's the Bala Simcha of this whole sugya, he said that's not what Rav Moshe says. Let's leave it aside. Source 21, Lior Segev. So he quotes himself. It's very nice. Always a good idea. He says no. What Rav Moshe doesn't say the difference is what's the reason for the action. What Rav Moshe says is the difference between making an incision and removing a needle. Not because of what's the aim, but because of the modus operandi. When I make a needle, it's not nivul hamet, because that's what people do. As opposed to making an incision, which is also an answer to your question about the kidney. That's different. Even though people do it, people donate their kidneys, it's still considered to be an operation. That Rav Moshe says no. So the machloket between Professor Steinberg and Rabbi Lior Segev is how do we understand Rav Moshe Feinstein? The Rav Moshe Feinstein say anything that's normal can be done means limited to diagnosis, or anything normal means limited to things that are not huge incisions and removing organs. The nafkamina would be, let's imagine, removing sperm. Because we're not removing sperm for the case of diagnosis, it's for a treatment. But if Rabbi Segev is right, then it's actually the way that it's done doesn't leave any sort of obvious damage on the body. There'll be a very small incision. The question we said, well, what about if the person wants it? That's the next question. That's in Makor 22. Rabbi the Sridei Eish, Rabbi Yaakov Yechiel Weinberg, writing in Tchumen. Tchumen is a halachic penny on the back shelf there of Tzomet, and it's been, I think they're now on volume 45 or something. So this is in volume 12. It comes out annually, so you can work out how many years ago it was. Hayom Odiuli, the telephone, mi Montreux, hikvot torato mevakesh, lishmoa havot dati, haklusha al shelat, b'davar nituach metim. So we're talking about 30 years ago, maybe 40 years ago. It's the beginning of autopsies, beginning of transplants. L'shem hakarat tiva machala. We wanted to know he wants to know what he died from. Autopsy, a biopsy, a post-mortem. Lo nitbareh li b'telefon mi hashoel. I don't know who's asking. This guy, doesn't matter. Timhati lama nechkak lekach. Why do we need it? V'arei zo sheila noshana. It's an old question. שנתחכמו בה גדולי עולם בדורות שלפנינו. In the previous generation already had discussed. ונודע ביהודה ואחיו גדולי ישראל אסרו. נודע ביהודה we just saw said it אסרו. וכבר הורה זקן ראש רבנים לישראל הגאון הרב הרצוג להתיר. הרב הרצוג says מותר. אם המת נתן רשות קודם מותו לנתח את גופו. Rav Herzog says you're allowed to do a post-mortem on the condition that the person gave their agreement. Like you said, I wrote on the driving license, I agreed it. An agreement, that seems to make a difference. That's what Rav Herzog says. So he says, Machloket. The Nodab Yehuda says, doesn't matter if you gave an agreement. And the Rav Herzog says, if you gave an agreement, it's okay. L'shem Torah she'en b'zeh mishum nivul hamet, v'lo mishum hana'at hamet. Only if there's a need. Only if there's a need. And said because there's no need. The person wants to do it. We'll have to do it. We think maybe what they died from. That's not so clear. The Gemara in Masechet. We go to the last page, page 24. We just got a little bit. It's okay. The Gemara in Masechet Sanhedrin Daf Mem Vav Amud Bet says the following: Kvura mishum bizyonahu. Why are we obligated to bury someone? Is it because of bizayon? Because we are degrading the person to leave him lying in the street decomposing? Or mishum kaparahu. Maybe it's atonement. Person is buried, prepared for burial, that's atonement. That's what the Gemara asks. Lamay nafkin, what do we care? The amar lo ba'in lekvurei lahu gavra. He says we don't want to bury this guy. If it's for atonement, maybe he was such a rasha that he doesn't be atoned. If it's for not to degrade them, so pashut. What about the person? Yamarte mishum bizyonahu lo kol kaminei. Says the Gemara, what if he asked himself? He leaves instructions, I don't want to be buried. I want to be cremated. I want to be stuffed and left on the chair. At a nice chair, I want to be stuffed left on the chair. Have that. I heard both of these. Says the Gemara, if it's because of bizayon, if it's because of degrading, he doesn't make that decision. Why? Because it's degrading, it's not for you, it's for the whole of humanity. It's degrading humanity to have dead bodies around. The Rashi says, it's an embarrassment for the krovim. So you see that even though this person said, I don't want to be buried, we don't listen to them. But we know there's a mitzvah to listen to divrei hamet. The person gives an instruction, we have to listen to what they said. No nachon. Oh, it's very limited what the person is able to say. Says the Torah, it's not only because of the family, the krovim, like Rashi says. Everybody, humanity, be embarrassed to have dead bodies sitting around. So it's not so healthy. The Rambam says, Nechot avel, avalim siva, the person that said, Shelo yikavel, en shomim lo, we don't listen to you. Even though we listen to what the dead person says, we don't listen to everything. Shakfura mitzvah, sheneba bo kavod tikvarein, not because it's bizayon, because the mitzvah. You said to me, don't care a mitzvah? Why do you get that decision? Says the Srida Esh, we said before, v'nir'eh li liyashev. The Rambam sover shegemara utzcha gam letam kvura hu me'atorah. Why do we need to have two different reasons? Why doesn't the Rambam's reason make sense? Why? We have to bury the person. Why does the Gemara say because of bizayon or because of kapara? Why does it say because we have a mitzvah to bury? I can't tell me don't come in the mitzvah. Says the Srida Esh because what the Rambam's looking for is a reason from the Torah. Why is it related to bizayon? We have to follow what our father said. Therefore we must say, since there's a mitzvah to bury the person, we do not listen to what they say. We generally follow the instructions of a dead person unless they say we don't do something against the Torah. And therefore the Gemara is talking about theoretically what's bizayon. The Rambam says, but there has to be a halachic reason. If the person said, no, it's not bizayon, I'm happy, I'll be put in a shelf, I'll be frozen, I'm not going to disturb anybody, we won't be bizayon, still we have a mitzvah to bury the person. So even though if the family have a different decision, the person has a different decision, we don't always listen to them. So let's say there's an isur, let's say we do think there's an isur to remove sperm. And the person says, no, but I wanted to. That's not so pashut. You'll have to do something. You're asking me to break an isur of nivul hamet because you wanted to. That's not so pashut. But what about the family says? The person doesn't say anything. The family says. That's Allah. We'll finish with this. It says the Ramah. Kadvu agot ashri. B'shem avot b'shem ozarua. Shekata b'shem Rabbeinu Tam v'Rabbeinu Simcha. Reuven. שהיה חייב לשמעון. ראובן owes שמעון money. ומת ראובן, and Reuven dies. יכול שמעון לעכב קבורתו עד שיפרעו לו. Reuven can say, hey, what about my money? I'm not going to bury him. He shouldn't get buried until I get paid. יפה, לא? ואם שמעון הוא קרובו של ראובן, and if Shimon is Reuven's relative, בני המשפחה מוחים בידו, שלא לעכב קבורה. The family can say, no, we want to bury him. שלא לנבלו. We don't want it to מנבל. So you see that the family has some input into the question of, are you allowed to menavel or not allowed to menavel? Are you allowed to keep menavel or not? Says the Rabbeinu Gershom on the Gemara in Baba Batra, Mishum de mishpachto have lo hayu rotzim lenavlo. Klomar, ein isur yetzer al kovei mishpacha. It's not that the family have a bigger say. Ela shemistama hem yoter dogim lichvod hamet masher acherim. They are more concerned about the burial of the baby, of the dead body. But it's not that they have a say. We listen to the krovim. Say, well, the family make a decision. No, the family have no more say than anybody else. The family would say, we want to bury the person upside down. They would say, we don't listen to the family. The halacha is not like that. Or the family can decide, we want to have this order or that order. We want to say, no, we don't do it. So the family is not more important than anybody else. Why, therefore, in the halacha that we say the family can say we have to bury them? Because the family cares the person should be buried. They're the responsibility. They're responsible for that question. Says Rav Moshe, and with this we'll finish. לכן אמינה, יש חלוק בין מנוולים, the Gemara לא הזכר איזה ניבול היה שם בבדיקה. The Gemara doesn't say what exact degrading were we doing. שלכן נראה לנו דתי בניבול ממש שהוא לפתוח הקבר, to open up the grave. That's ניבול המת. Remember they say we don't know who's buried here. We want to do some test after they were buried. So open up the kever. אחר זמן שלפי דרך הנלקה ונקבע אין יכולים אף אחרים אף שיסידו ממונם בשבילם. We want to open up the burial. We want to open up to see who it was. Maybe there's a financial question. We don't listen to them. ואם הוא קודם קבורה והניבול הוא רק מה שקבוע קבורה. But if it's before they're buried, and the whole problem will be, are we going to delay the burial עד שיבואו אנשים בקיאים לבדוק, זה תלוי בדין הקבורה. Then that's a different question. So it says Rav Moshe, depends when we're talking. What level of nivul? Are we talking about we're going to prevent the burial for a few hours? It's different now because we do that for many times. We have people, we prevent the burial, but we delay the burial because we have family in Chutz La'aretz are going to come. We have this now, a friend of mine, his mother died, and she died on Friday, and the burial was on Monday. What happened? They had a brother in Australia by the time he came into the customer. So that we do. However, to degrade them by digging up the grave, that already is a limit. So it says that Moshe, therefore you see there's a level of degrading. So what we saw, so l'sakem, can a soldier live to get forever? Not so simple. Are we allowed to remove sperm? It seems to be that there's a number of problems from nivul hamet causing damage to the body, delaying burial, possibly not burying the entire body. There seems to be a question of, are we allowed to use that sperm? We didn't even get into the question of using the sperm with a random person. That's also a question. Or to just use it and to freeze it until some point in which we decide. I'll tell you a Maisa that we had many years ago. And that I'll close with. We had a case, a very tragic case. A young man went through cancer, had cancer and went through treatment. And before treatment he froze his sperm. And he died, unfortunately. And the parents wanted to use the sperm to use it to get... What?
Was he married?
No, young man who was in his teens, teenager. And the parents want to use the sperm. And Rav Mordechai Eliyahu Zatzal said to them that they should bury the sperm together with the young man. Now that's not true halachically. We have no obligation to bury the sperm. So that's in the Kazai. I said, why did he say that? I think he had a very important idea. His idea was there should be closure. You should realize with all of the sadness that people die, that's a finality. And the idea that we can continue living forever is somewhat of a problem philosophically and theologically. That people, we live and we die, and we have to come to the terms with that that's sometimes a finality. If somebody already has sperm frozen, they already have embryos frozen, maybe that's a different question, but that's for another time.
Defective genes.
What? Yeah, we can test that. That's not so. It's not custom. So.
What happens when they remove a kidney because it has cancer?
So a kidney is also something else to carry. It doesn't have a bone in it.